And it's funny because there's our recording. Our students worked with the LGBT Chamber of Commerce several years ago, and we've had that relationship ever since. So it's always a pleasure to come back to speak. And today in particular, we're going to be talking about essentially the science of marketing and the science behind it, which you might be thinking, okay, that's a very specific topic, like the science of marketing. But what we're finding is more and more, and you probably experience this yourself as business owners or working in the business community, that making data-driven decisions is the name of the game these days, right? Analytics is a buzzword that we keep hearing more about. And even DePaul, all of us are sort of moving into this space and making sure our students are trained in this world of analytics, doing experiments within the workplace, and then getting the data that can help you make better decisions, more efficient decisions. So what I'm going to do is go over that with you today. Just by way of background, I'm Jim. You can call me Jim in the chat, on video, whatever. I've been at DePaul now for 8 years, which is very difficult to believe. But prior to being at DePaul, I did my PhD at the University of Michigan in marketing, consumer psychology specifically. And prior to that, I did consulting and management marketing out in Los Angeles. So I love this opportunity to connect with actual business practitioners. I don't like to just sit in the ivory tower. I do like to keep that two-way communication going so that we can be sure we're addressing problems you're facing in the business world. And I can do research that will change how you do business. So that said, let's go ahead and jump into this. Now, I will say, I like to make my classes super interactive, and my webinar virtual versions of this are no different. So if you want to use the chat functionality, don't forget to set it to everyone, because otherwise only a couple people will get the messages. But I want you to answer these questions. They're pretty straightforward. So the first question is this. We know that in the world, there are the right-brained people and the left-brained people. Right-brained people are more creative. Left-brained people are more analytical. So if you had to say you're more right-brained or left-brained, what would you say you are? You can type your answer in the chat on the side. Keep pulling it up. Jeremy says right, hates math. Ludwig says left, cool. All right, keep them coming in. Alan says right-brained. Great, some creative types here. John says right-brained, cool. Everyone, okay, so a lot of right-brained folks. Somebody said, Christopher said a mix of both. Howard says right-brained. Somewhere in the middle says Jonathan. Okay, great. You're crushing this participation piece, right? So keep going. Okay, says both. I'm an artist who can make a list. I like I like that. All right. Second question. What should lead a company's strategy, right? Both are important, but what do you think should really drive strategy? Do you think it should be creativity and innovation, or do you think it should be hard data, like the facts, like this is what the numbers show, this is what the budget is? What do you think? If you had to choose one, which one do you think matters more? Alan says hard data, got data. Of course, I just gave you this whole spiel about data-driven. Okay, Ludwig says creativity. Howard says both. He's not going to be forced to choose. All right, data says lead strategy, and then creativity tell the story on why. Cool. Creativity built on hard data. Christopher sees where I'm going with this. Yeah, all right. And then finally, on a scale from 1 to 10, how much did you really understand statistics when you took it, right? Maybe some of you have never taken it, but probably most of you did. On a scale from, like, let's say 1 to 10, like 1, I don't understand statistics at all. I just like eked by, or 10, I'm like a math wizard, right? You might win the Nobel Prize in mathematics someday. Got 6s, 8.5, 7. All right. So far, so good. We're about average then on that scale from 1 to 10. Okay, great. So what I'm going to do for the next hour or so is just talk a little bit about consumer insights and specifically how we understand human psychology and motivation in consumer context. Regardless of what business you're in, you're dealing with humans, right? And we know certain things about humans and the way they behave, and we can predict the way humans are going to behave in consumer context. So what I hope you get out of this is I really want you to think about your particular line of business, whatever industry you're in, and how you can design even experiments naturally to set up with your consumers in a way that you can draw meaningful conclusions about how you're doing business, right? So let's go back. We'll revisit those 3 questions. That's me. So let's go back to those questions very quickly. When I asked you if you're more right brain or left brain, we got a mix of both. A lot of you tended to say right brain, though. We probably had more right brain than left brain folks. And I'm here to tell you something. If you learn nothing else today, learn that this is not a thing, right? So this notion of left brain, right brain stems from some really misunderstood psychology about how the brain worked, and literally like physiological damage of the brain and what patients with physiological brain damage could or could not do. So we talk about hemispheres of the brain and how they operate, but just know we're all capable of doing analytical and creative things. We might prefer one or the other, but it's not like we're hardwired to be an analytical or a creative person, right? We can do both. All right, so that leads to the second question, and some of you caught on to the fact that, yeah, that is a trick question, right? So neither creativity nor hard data ultimately lead the way. And I believe it was Christopher, who's someone who said, essentially what we really want to do is capture the data and then see what the story is coming out of the data, right? Be able to storytell in that sense. In fact, we teach storytelling through data now at DePaul, and a lot of business schools teach this, because what we want to do is teach students to have this balance, to be able to speak both languages, that of the creative, but that of the researcher, the data-driven person as well. And if we do it right, then basically our creative is informed by data. And we're going to see some examples of that today for CocaCola, actually. So I just saw Jeremy's note. You're gonna have to stop using that excuse. Yeah, you're not either right brain or left brain. Finally, for statistics. Now, you're better than average. When I give this talk, I got to tell you, I get a lot of 1s and 2s here. But this is a function of, one, whomever your professor was or your teacher was in high school for statistics. And then secondarily, like if you tend to be someone who fears when equations are popped up on a screen and run away from it, or somebody that kind of leans into the challenge of statistics. But I will tell you, as somebody who teaches college students on a daily basis, the statistics, the way statistics is best taught is when it's applied or practical. This should come as no surprise. And it just so happens that some professors are better doing that than others. So what I want to do for you today, just really quick rundown of the agenda, is talk about this notion of numerophobia, this fear of numbers that so many people have, and why then we don't often like to look at the data when we're making business decisions. We're going to talk about experimenting in college. Ooh, nice way to end the day. Not in the way you're thinking, but we'll talk about it in the context of what we do as academic researchers in the business school. We'll talk about modeling consumer behavior, not the kind of modeling you're thinking. And then we'll talk about this notion of reconciling art and science. You already kind of had a bit of a spoiler by saying that we don't really live in a world where creativity and data need to be separate. If anything, they should be embraced together. And people who are the most successful in business are the folks that understand that, right? That are comfortable with the data and can see the story and the data, what the data tell, but then translate that into meaningful creative innovations for consumers in the marketplace. And then finally, we'll wrap up with a modern conversation of how technology is sort of changing this game with creativity and data, sort of automating a lot of what we used to have to do by hand. So we'll start with this notion of numerophobia, which, as it sounds, is the fear of numbers, and why you should start to learn to love statistics. So just want to start by saying that most people, so like 93% of Americans, say they have some sort of math anxiety, which is a surprisingly high number for a math nerd like me. I loved calculus in high school. I don't know why. And many of you like math as well. So we're kindred spirits, but there are some of you who are probably too shy to be like, oh, I'm like a 1 out of 10 on that stats question. And that's okay. You're clearly not alone. The other thing to notice here is that the US isn't really doing a bang up job when it comes to teaching math literacy, right? Or numeracy, as we like to call it. Now, the reason for this, of course, as I said, is that we often don't teach math in a way that feels relevant to students, even at the collegiate level, but by basically putting it into context. And so today we're going to talk about math in a business context. You'll start to see the relevance and appreciate it a little bit more in terms of what it can do for you, right? So my philosophy on this is, 1, math is just another language like French or Spanish, right? 2, data can tell stories, which we know. And 3, which excites me as a professor, is we as researchers, as people who conduct original experiments, get to discover and translate new information from data into meaningful market solutions for companies and, of course, for consumers. So let's do a real world example. So this is where you get to play along, because I like to keep things interactive. Let's say that you are trying to figure out where to spend a marketing budget across different social media types. So for those of you maybe not as familiar, of course, we have Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube, and that last one is TikTok, right? Which is all the rage these days. So if I said to you, you have $100 to spend, right? And you have to divide it across these different social media platforms. You only have $100. What does your gut tell you? How do you think you would divide that $100 across these 6 media platforms? What would you say? You can type it in the chat, or you can undo your video or turn on your video if you want to speak. What would you do? Just gut instinct. Where would you put the money? Don't be shy. There's no like right or wrong answer here. Okay, Christopher says it depends on what the target market is. Great. Elaborate on that, Christopher. What would you do depending on a different target market? Kay says Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. Okay. 25 Facebook, 25 Instagram probably, and divide the rest. Okay. All right, so everyone has a strategy. Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, cool. All right, so based on your gut instinct, we have kind of a diversity of responses here, right? Like nobody's kind of saying the same thing. Some things are conditional, but we don't really know. Okay, so let's say we just do a really quick survey of about 1,000 people, right? And we'll say these people are within our target market to control for Christopher's concern. And we find that on average, this is the number of times people within this market visit each site per day, right? So on average, they visit Facebook 23 times per day, Twitter 20.1 times per day, and so on down the road. Now, knowing this information, how might you allocate your money here? Where would you spend your money? That $100, same $100 we had before. Does this change your decision? Looking at the numbers, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok says K. All right, so now TikTok's in the game. Jeremy says, I was on the right path. I was going to put 50 in for Instagram, 25 for Facebook and LinkedIn. Okay, so the numbers meet what your gut instinct said, Jeremy. That's good. Anybody else? How would you divide based on this information? Okay, Ludwig says 23 Facebook, 20 Twitter, 26 Instagram. Wow, I like these breakdowns of that 100. Cool. All right, so let's go one step further. All right, so we're going to introduce one more concept here, which is called the standard deviation. So I'm going to ask a question before we go into the big sort of overall how you're going to allocate your money. Looking at this information, so we have the mean, we have the average number of site visits per day, but now we also have this thing called the standard deviation, which a lot of people don't understand what it actually is. So my question here is, which one of these social media sites has the least amount of variability in the average visits? Because remember, we're interviewing 1,000 people, and on average, people visit Facebook 23 times per day, but not every one of those 1,000 people goes to Facebook 23 times, right? Some go 26, some go 20, some go 16. So what does the standard deviation tell us, right? That's what we're really going for here. And to answer this question, we'll get there, right? So what site, according to these numbers, which site has the least variability in the average number of visitors per day? People are afraid. Like, I don't want to get this wrong in front of my friends. What does that standard deviation tell us? Ah, yeah, some people are like, I don't really remember what this says. Okay, see Instagram, we see YouTube. All right, I will tell you, it is LinkedIn, right? And look at the standard deviation, right? So what we're saying here, what a standard deviation is how much does the data vary around that average, right? Around that midpoint, that mean, right? So when you're looking at this, you can see that on average, people visit LinkedIn 21 times per day. And the standard deviation, the variation away from that mean of 21, is about 9, right? And that's significantly lower than all the other standard deviations across these different social media platforms. So what this is saying is the mean is the average number of times people visit the site. The standard deviation is the variability among responses from the 1,000 people that we surveyed, right? So what that means is, on average, people are visiting LinkedIn about 21 times per day. And that's a pretty accurate number across all 1,000 people, right? Most people visited around 21 times a day. But if we look conversely, where is there the greatest variability? Which standard deviation is the highest? Why don't you look at the numbers real quick? So LinkedIn has the lowest variation or variability, which, so we see TikTok is 23.1. There's one a little bit higher. You got this. Look over here at Instagram. Yeah, there we go. You're like, I see it. Okay. So what that means then is that on average for Instagram, people are visiting Instagram 26 times a day, but there's a lot of variability, right? Some people might be really high, like 35, 36. Some people might be really low, like 9 or 10. So there's a lot of variation around that. Now, why does that matter? Well, it matters because in statistics, we're going to pull back in the statistics piece here, we can start doing comparisons, right? This is a sample of a population. So all it's telling us is on average, this is what people visit and how that variability looks across the sample. But in terms of making estimates about a population, which when we're dealing with consumers, when we're selling to millions of people, we care about this, right? So what we'll notice is if we compare Instagram to TikTok, it turns out that this difference, this 26 to 25, even though on average people visit Instagram more than TikTok, this is not a meaningful or statistical difference, right? The p-value is 0.22 if that brings back memories. But if we do some other comparisons, so this jump here, 26 to 23 visits, is significant according to our stats, right? Which means that people are significantly more likely to visit Instagram more frequently than they are Facebook. We'll do one more comparison. Same thing, that difference between 25.4 visits a day for TikTok is significantly different than the 23.4 visits for Facebook. It doesn't seem like that big of a number, right? Between 23 and 25, but statistically, it's a meaningful difference. Now, why am I telling you all this? Without going into statistics, even in more detail, here's what I want you to take away. When we do those statistical comparisons, this is what happens. We find out that Instagram and TikTok aren't significantly different from one another. Even though that number was higher, like numerically, statistically, it was not meaningfully different, right? But we do know that both Instagram and TikTok are significantly higher than Facebook, and that Facebook is statistically different from LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. So when we go back to that original question of how do we allocate money across these social media sites, instead of having really 6 different sites we have to choose from, we really have 3 tiers of sites, right? We have Instagram and TikTok at the top, where we're going to spend most of our budget. We have Facebook kind of in between, so a little bit less. And then finally, we have LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube, which also don't differ from one another. And we would be spending the least amount of money for those 3. All right. So again, your gut might say, hey, let's put all of our money in Instagram, or hey, TikTok is all the rage these days, so let's go after that. But it turns out, assuming that our target market is represented across these things, because Christopher had a great point on that, what we want to know is statistically, how do these sites differ from one another? And that's what statistics allows us to do, right? To make smarter decisions. All right, you survived the hardest part of today's talk, which is a little review of statistics. So let's talk a little bit about experimenting and why that matters in a business school and why that should matter for your business. So when I tell people that I'm a professor, they tend to think that I spend like 99% of my time in the classroom. And in actuality, I spend probably like 20% of my time in the classroom, maybe even 10%, and about 80 to 90% of my time in my office or in my lab doing research, right? Conducting original business research. So I love teaching. So like, let's be clear about that. But a big part of being a business professor, particularly at a research institution, is to create new insights to help business people out in the real world do their work better, right? So a couple of things I want to remind you about before we get into this notion of experimentation is 1, how does science work? 2, what does hypothesis testing look like? And 3, what does a p-value mean? Now, this might be something that you think was limited to chemistry or biology back in the day in high school, but it turns out that we do this kind of stuff in business all the time, right? So let's discuss these. The good news is that science in business works the same as science in chemistry or science in biology and science in physics, right? So if we think all the way back to grade school, probably when we first started doing a little bit of experimentation, we might have had an experiment where you had a control, right? So say you have this little plant right here, and then you had what we would call test or experimental conditions. So you have 3 other plants, they're all identical to this control plant, except we're going to make some changes. And those changes mean we are going to add fertilizer. So in this first plant here, we're going to add 1 thing of fertilizer. In the second plant, we're going to add 2. And in the third plant, we're going to add 3. Our control group, we're not going to touch, right? Because that's going to be our comparison, our baseline. And what we're going to try to do is figure out if adding different amounts of fertilizer cause differences in the height of this plant, right? So to kind of get the terminology back, the independent variable, the thing that we're changing, the thing that we're manipulating, is the amount of fertilizer we're putting into the plant, right? And the dependent variable, the outcome, the measure we're looking for is, in this case, the height of the plant after 1 month. So how tall the plant gets based on how we change the fertilizer, right? Now, it's important we control everything else, right? So we want to make sure each plant is getting the same amount of water, the same amount of sun, and so on, because in the world of science, we only want to change 1 thing, right? Otherwise, if a plant is getting more sunlight or less sunlight, or this plant was watered more or less, we can't be sure if we get results, what was the cause of that result, right? If we keep everything else the same and only change the amount of fertilizer, then if the plants change in height significantly, we'll know that the fertilizer was the cause, right? That was the reason that the height changed. Now, that then leads us back to hypothesis testing, which, if you can recall, all the way back from grade school, all the way through high school, we created these sort of if-then predictions about what's going to happen. Now, people usually freak out about this because they were never taught how to do hypothesis testing early on. But let's go through this like 5th grade experiment. So when I get to the business experiment, it'll make a lot of sense. So what we do in science, of course, is we have what's called a null hypothesis, or H sub naught. And essentially, the way to translate that in the most basic English possible is there are no relationships between any 2 things in the world, right? So in other words, life is completely random. No 2 things are connected in the world. We live in a random universe, right? We'll compare that to what we call the alternative hypothesis. And this is where things get sexy, right? Because the alternative hypothesis says, no, that's not true. I think there is a relationship between A and B. And here's what I think it is, right? So to put in the context of this current experiment, H naught, remember that the world is completely random, would be fertilizer has no impact on the plant height, right? There's no relationship between these 2 things. The world is completely random. But our alternative hypothesis might be, if we add more fertilizer, a plant gets taller, right? So that's the alternative. We're saying there is a relationship between fertilizer and how tall the plant gets, right? So over time, we let these things grow, and lo and behold, we see that when you put more fertilizer in, the plant gets taller. We would run statistics. We're not going to get into numbers on this talk, but if we get a p is less than 0.05, we know that there is a significant statistical difference here, that yes, fertilizer actually predicts the height of a plant, right? There is a relationship between these 2 things. If not, say over time, the plants all look the same. Statistically, things don't look great. P-value is greater than 0.05, then chances are fertilizer doesn't have anything to do, at least alone, with plant height. That's kind of the idea, right? Great. If you're still with me, we're on a good term here, right? So because now what we're going to do is pivot a little bit away from fifth grade science to modern business science, which is something that should be useful for you in the context of the work you're doing. And I'll give you an example of a project that I did. So one research question we had was, does the color saturation of a commercial affect how interested people are in an advertised product, right? So let me give you an example visually here. So if we have a control commercial, so we show people an advertisement for CocaCola, a 30-second spot or a 60-second spot, what we were wondering is if we change the color saturation, so we decrease the color saturation or we increase the color saturation over the 30 to 60 seconds of the ad, does that change something about how attractive people find Coca-Cola, right? Again, going back to our terminology that we just reviewed, the null hypothesis here, H naught, would be that there's no relationship, right? The world is completely random. Changing color saturation should not change the level of interest people have in the advertised product, in this case, Coca-Cola, right? Our alternative hypothesis was actually saturation changes of any kind, whether up or down, should lead to greater interest in the advertised product, which in this case was Coca-Cola. So we ran the study and it manipulated the video, all these things, changing saturation. And at the end, we asked people, how interested are you in purchasing the advertised product? Coca-Cola in this case. Now, I will note that there are better measures of this rather than just self-report. So in the lab, we can do things like physiological measures. We can ask the time people spend, purchase intentions, willingness to pay, all this. But for the sake of simplicity, the question that we asked in this case was, how interested are you in purchasing this product? And lo and behold, we found significant results that when you change the color saturation of an advertisement, instead of just keeping it the same throughout the commercial, people report that they're more interested, significantly more interested in purchasing Coca-Cola, right? Kind of weird. So we can't stop there. Moving on to this idea of modeling consumer behavior, we've just discovered something really interesting, right? That changing the color saturation of any commercial, we did it for Coca-Cola, we did it for SeaWorld, we did it for Starbucks, changes the interest people have in the product that's being advertised. But it's not enough, right? If that were my job, it would be super simple, but our job is more complex than that. We want to understand why that's the case, right? So to do that, we create mathematical models, right? We want to understand how different pieces of human psychology are related to the end behavior, the consequences in the marketplace. So what we want to do is dig in a little bit more and ask the question, well, why does changing the saturation increase interest in a product, right? So, to reiterate, we found just by changing saturation, we know that consumers say that they're more interested in Coca-Cola, right? We know that's the case. So let me ask you, why do you think that might be, right? So as a scientist, that's what we have to start thinking is, what about human psychology? By changing the saturation of a commercial, why do you think this would make people say they're more interested in the product being advertised? What comes to mind for you? I'm curious to hear your thoughts. What might make people more interested in a product if the saturation of the commercial is changing? What do you think? Feeling and vibes, nostalgia, okay. Other thoughts? Some of you are like, I have no clue, Jim. No idea. I would never think that saturation changes would change things. Looks like the logo is easier to spot, so there's less to look at in the ad. Okay, so a little more focused, I see. We're gonna come back to this in a little bit on another experiment. All right, so these are good potential mechanisms for this, right? So we were thinking the same kind of things, right? We're like, well, maybe it's just more aesthetically pleasing, right? Maybe people just like the ad more because something is changing about it. That's one potential explanation. Another one might be this notion of physiological arousal, right? So something is changing in our senses, right? In this case, our visual field, the color saturation is changing. So that facilitates arousal in the brain. And maybe that arousal gets attributed to the product. And maybe it's time perception, right? So maybe something about the changing saturation of a commercial makes us feel like time is running out, or we have to hurry and get the product. So we can test all of these things, right? We can run experiments to test each of these things and then statistically test this model. And what we find is it's actually this physiological arousal piece, right? So what it means is, by seeing this change, this subtle change in the saturation of advertisement, what that's happening in our brain is there's greater experienced arousal, and we misattribute that arousal to how much we like the product when asked, how much do you like this product, right? Ruling out that the ad is aesthetically pleasing when there's saturation, or the fact that it changes one's perception of time, right? Now, we call this mediation. This is the underlying process, right? It's not enough just to say that changing saturation leads to more liking of the product. Instead, what we want to know is, oh, wow, changing saturation changes how physiological aroused we feel. And then that physiological arousal is misattributed to how much we like the product, right? So changing saturation increases physiological arousal. And if we are physiologically aroused when we are asked if we like something, we tend to say that we love something instead of just liking it. Why do we care about this? Isn't it just enough to know as practitioners that increasing or decreasing saturation leads to greater liking? Kind of, but by knowing what the underlying process is, now we can ask ourselves, well, what can we do as marketers to change the physiological arousal for our consumers? If we know that the more physiologically aroused somebody is when they're thinking about our brand, our product, our company, makes them like it more, then maybe we can change the size of the product over time. So in the Starbucks version, what we did is vary the size of a cup, like a couple percent each screen, to the point where it was like twice as large or twice as small. And consumers never noticed it. They didn't notice explicitly we were changing the size, but our brain processes that information automatically. So the physiological arousal was already there, and it led to them liking it more, right? So just by changing the size of the Coke product in the ad, we can get that physiological arousal, which then leads to greater liking, right? So that worked as well. So that's the idea. That's why we care about the underlying process, because once we know the underlying process, then we know other ways to trigger that underlying process, which gets to the market outcome of people liking our product more, all right? Okay, so if you're still with me so far, I know we're deep diving into science here. What I'm going to do now is reconcile this difference between art and science. When I asked you at the very beginning whether or not you were more right brain or left brain, some of you like really leaned into right brain. Some of you are like, no, I like data. So the deal is, of course, that these two things are not mutually exclusive, that art and science can coexist happily. So I hope that if you don't believe that you, by the end of this talk, you know that it's true. Because the way we're training business students now, DePaul has made big investments in this, and business schools around the world are doing the same thing, is essentially, especially with our marketing students, teaching them to understand data, to know how to capture data, like do the analyses, and then get the story that the data is telling to then make really effective creative solutions or executions, right? And that could be anything from the type of advertising you're doing to the type of product you're creating for consumers. And that it's easier to do, right? Because capturing that data now is a lot easier and cheaper than it was years ago. So let's do another example very quickly to show you the power of this, which is this notion of ad avoidance. So with the sort of innovation of technology comes challenges in the marketplace, particularly when you're a marketer like I am. One of those challenges, of course, with TV is now people just avoid advertisements, right? So whether that's watching TV and fast forwarding, or whether it's like subscribing and paying more so you don't have to watch advertisements, or if it's just scrolling through social media and clicking away advertisements as they come through or hiding them, there's a lot of ways for consumers to avoid advertisements. Now, unfortunately, for business people like yourselves, that's a challenge, because if you're spending money on these different social media, social networks, or through traditional media, whether it's TV, print, whatever, if you know that people aren't paying as much attention to advertisements, whether emerging social media or traditional media, that's a waste of money. So one of the questions that a colleague of mine who I worked with at Michigan, he went to Harvard after as a professor, he was curious as to when a brand logo should appear in a commercial, right? So say, for example, you have a 60-second commercial, you got your typical 60-second commercial. At what point during the 60 seconds should you show the commercial or the brand logo, right? So if you're Coca-Cola, when do you show the iconic red logo? If you're Starbucks, when do you show the little mermaid person? So there are three options, right? There's the upfront, so show the brand logo upfront. So we know this is Coca-Cola. Anything that comes after is going to be thought of through the lens of or the context of Coca-Cola, right? So people will know that it's Coca-Cola right off the bat. An alternative, option B, is no, show the commercial, entertain people, get them captivated using whatever talents you have artistically, and then at the end, leave them with the logo, right? It's like, hey, by the way, this was Coca-Cola, and that kind of has a recency effect, right? That's the last thing that they recall. Or there's an alternative where you pulse, right? So over the same amount of time, you break it up and show the logo kind of throughout the commercial, hoping that by showing it frequently throughout the commercial, that leaves a greater impression on memory than showing it just at the beginning or just at the end. So question for you, which of these three options do you think is the most effective when it comes to recalling information about a commercial? Putting the brand logo up front, so sort of contextualizing things up front, that's option A. Option B, putting it at the end, so it's the last thing consumers remember. Or C, putting little bits and pieces throughout the commercial. What do you think? All right, so Robin says, looks like the logo is easier to spot, so less to look. Oh, sorry, that was from last time. Alan says B, so at the end. All right, other thoughts? C, says Ludwig. B, says Christina. Okay, great. We're not unanimous. All right, so I'll tell you what they found as your answers keep coming in. So it turns out it's actually C, right? So kind of pulsing the ad or the logo throughout led to greater recognition, greater recall of content from the advertisement, of course, and greater brand affinity as well. So it actually had a lot of really interesting effects on consumers that were watching it. And what's so cool about that is they were able to replicate this using eye tracking studies. So they were able to see where the eyes were going throughout the advertisement. And what was interesting is the eyes kept going back to the brand logo when it was shown throughout in that last version in option C, which then had positive impact on recall, brand affinity, and things like this, right? So it's kind of weird to think that we can model the ideal placement of the logo throughout a commercial, but we can. That's the kind of research that we're doing. A colleague of mine in Paris, actually, so he's a practitioner, but he has a company where they test this stuff sort of automatically. So what's so great about the way Augustin does his work is they'll have a commercial where they'll have the ad with the brand in certain places, an ad with the brand in other places, or no brand at all, or whatever. And what they find, they can actually show data using thousands of participants online, which of the ads is the most effective, right? And we're going to talk about that automation in just a second. So that's the idea. I want to show you, if I can, the ad. Let's see if it'll play for you. Can you hear that music when I play it? I hope. Which I'll have you watch the commercial. If you can hear it, that's great. You don't need to hear the sound. You can hear. Okay, great. Here it goes. Just watch the logo or watch Coca-Cola as it's placed throughout the ad. All right, so I'm not sure if you've seen this spot before from Coca-Cola, but what's interesting about it, it's the first time Coca-Cola has actually advertised all of its products in the same campaign. So usually, if you can recall, Classic Coke has its own commercials. Diet Coke has its own commercials. Remember the sexy guy from like the 1980s or 90s, right? The construction work and all the women went crazy. So Diet Coke has its own thing. Coke Zero had its own advertisements. So with the Taste the Feeling campaign, what Coca-Cola decided to do was actually advertise all of its brands within the Coca-Cola name under one commercial. And you'll notice throughout that spot, you see the name Coca-Cola and you see the product kind of pulsing, the last strategy, throughout the commercial. And if you don't think that's based on data, you're sorely mistaken, because these are the sorts of things that are tested quite extensively, especially for a brand like Coca-Cola that really does marketing well, right? So again, we might be thinking, oh, does this actually make a difference? Well, empirically, when we capture the data and look at this in sort of controlled laboratory settings, and then we kind of open it out so we get external validity in the marketplace, we do see a difference in terms of recall, attention, and of course, brand liking, which is important. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about new technology. And if we have time, I want to engage you in an activity. I don't like my students leaving without some like key takeaway that's going to change your business. So see you, Robin, don't worry. The last thing I want to talk about here is just how technology is changing this game today. As I mentioned at the very beginning, we are doing experiments all the time, right? So we do this all the time in the laboratory at business schools, but tech companies do this in their sleep, right? Like Facebook is running thousands of experiments right now. You don't even realize it. Same thing for Google. And why? Because it's easy for them to do so, right? Technology permits us to run experiments very easily. One thing that you're probably familiar with, and if you're not, you should be familiar with, is this notion of A/B testing, right? So when you land on a website, a lot of companies now do this automatically for you. Based on the color of a button or the placement of text or imagery, they will know with their algorithms which version of your website is more or less efficient at conversion or retaining people on the site. So if you don't know that, you should. But again, that just goes to show how natural experimentation is, particularly in the tech world. But what we've seen is over the past 10 years, where technology companies were really kind of at the forefront of this experimentation, now it's the expectation that everybody is aware of this, right? It's why we're hiring data analytics folks. That's why marketing is shifting into more of an analytical appreciation, or there's appreciation for analytics. I can't tell you how many times companies come to me asking for students who are trained in consumer insights. So lo and behold, we've invested a lot in developing our consumer insights wing of our department, right? So all that said, just realize that artificial intelligence, algorithms, machine learning, all that stuff is changing the ease with which, one, we can capture data, two, how easily we can analyze it, and three, how we can make changes dynamically based on that information. So for the sake of time, I won't show you this video, but just know that even models, right? So these people here are actually all computer generated, which is a little creepy, but it relates to the point over on this bottom right-hand corner, which is essentially we know that just by changing who appears in an advertisement or changing the text, we can dynamically change that based on who's visiting our site, what information we have about that individual, what cookies we have from where they were surfing online, things like this, in order to make the ad more effective, right? A little creepy, but that's the world we live in, right? Now, how does this affect you? Well, you should realize that everything you're typing is being recorded and experimented on, right? One thing we teach students now is this notion of text mining. So anything that's publicly available, so on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, you name it, there are researchers out there and companies that are scraping information and then making analyses according to that data, whether you like it or not, right? Of course, cookies, we know about this, where you're shopping, how long, information that is then passed on to companies that then serve you ads or suggested products based on your information. So that should be familiar to you. Sometimes the text mining stuff is not as familiar. We also do network analysis. So based on who's in your social media, we can make assumptions about who you might be and what products you're mostly likely to like. And the last thing I'll say here is that marketing is truly a one-to-one game these days. Now, some of you, when I was in business school, we talked about segmentation, targeting, all that kind of stuff. We still do that, right? We still segment, we still target. There's efficiency in that process. But now, because of technology, we are capable of customizing our marketing messages to you based on your specific individual needs, right? So that's what I say when I say one-to-one marketing. We have the technology that allows us to do that and allows us to do it dynamically. So we don't even have to intervene in that process. The technology will update the imagery or update the messaging to you automatically based on the data we have about you, right? So this clearly, as a marketing professor, it's like a bit of an ethical concern, right? Because privacy matters, but it's also an opportunity here, right? Because it's the future, right? As data becomes more easily accessible, as people are willing to make that trade-off between privacy and convenience or ease, we know the technology is going to change, right? It's happening in front of our eyes. We've all lived through it. But our goal remains the same, which at the end of the day, our goal as marketers and more broadly as business people is to find ways to create and deliver value to consumers. And if we can use data to understand and to experiment to understand how to do that better, then that's what we're going to be doing. And the companies that do that well are going to be the ones that succeed, especially the ones that automate that process to make sure they're fulfilling consumer demand as it comes in. So that is my quick run through of consumer insights and experimentation. But what I want to do before we jump is I'd like to, Jeremy, if we have time, I'll do a question and answer at the end, but I want to take like 5 minutes for you to work. We can do it together. Probably there's 16 of us, so we don't need to break into groups. But what are some ways, I want you to think about ways you might be able to do experimentation within your organization or within your business. Or if you have questions, we can talk about how you might go about doing experiments in your business. But from what we've talked about so far, what is something that maybe jumped out at you as like, you know what, I can totally see how I could try, if I tweak this one thing, it might actually give me some insight to how to be more efficient in what I'm spending my money on or how I'm doing my marketing. So has anyone had that moment, or should we brainstorm a little bit for your companies? Don't be shy. And if you want to, I think you can turn on your video too. Jeremy, is that right? Uh-oh. I think you're muted.
I am muted. I don't think so. I think we're in webinar, so I don't think.
Okay, that's all right. We can do it through chat. So if anyone has questions, or they're like, hey, Jim, this is what I do for a living. Help me think of an experiment I might be able to do for my business. We can use this time remaining to do that. Don't be shy. Now's your chance.
So going to give folks another moment. I know there was a lot of good activity in the chat box. So even if you just heard something that sounded interesting, feel free to comment on it. We'd love to know if there was anything you took away from this. This was really interesting for me. It was interesting to go back to a little statistics class for a little bit. I definitely feel this definitely was a smart way of thinking about marketing and how to go about engaging people, and how a lot of the things that we do in terms of our website or our strategy can really help to add extra influence to get people to make the desired action that we want them to make. So that was a really cool takeaway from me.
Yeah, and what we're seeing, as if anyone wants to ask questions, I'll just chat a little about what we're doing at DePaul. You can see the classes I teach, right? But what we're seeing a lot of interest in, particularly for people who even have business backgrounds or maybe study business at undergrad, is with a lot of people coming back to study specifically analytics, right? So we have the MS in analytics in our department, right? We also have people coming back to do MBAs with a focus of broader business analytics. And that just speaks to this need that I was telling you about, that the name of the game in business these days is data-driven decision making, which you're probably all familiar with, but also being able to translate that data, to collect it, analyze it, and translate it into meaningful creative executions, right? Whether that's new product development, whether that is more efficient marketing, one-to-one marketing, things like this. And so, that's something that if that's a skill that you wish you had, we have, at DePaul, we have these programs that allow you to study that specifically, whether it's a full MS degree. There's also certificate programs in analytics, especially if you want to do like the digital side, so you just want to learn how to do more digital marketing. All these things exist. And I gotta say, the people who are crushing it in the business world these days are the companies that are making data-driven decisions. So they're the people who are fluent in analytics and have that balance of creative and data. So feel free, come study with me. I'd love to teach you how to do these things better. Yeah, definitely try to figure out ways you can just run some natural experiments within your organization, right? Whether you're the owner of your business and can do that easily, or whether you are an employee of someone else's business, right? Like, think about how you can add value by making more data-driven decisions. So I see Christina in the chat says, our brand is called A Financial Doctor, and we help take the pain away from your finances to help clients and businesses become financially healthy. So something really interesting there, Christina, a natural experiment I have just from reading that description is the extent to which people psychologically identify pain. I think about how, and even in medicine these days, they still use the smiley face to frowny face, like how bad does it hurt, which is not the best way to capture pain. But I'd be interested to know, based on the solutions you're providing, if you've named them, how you name them, how you present them to consumers, the extent to which they feel that particular solution reduces financial pain, right? The psychological construct of financial pain. And you may find that using certain words makes people feel like they feel less pain, which then, of course, means they're more satisfied because they feel like your product has done more for them, right? Those are things you can measure. So if you want to talk about it, we can certainly talk about it offline. But that's where the magic of experimentation comes in. That's a natural way to do an experiment in this context, right?
Perfect. So while we wait to see if anyone, whether Christina or anyone else has any final thoughts, they want to chat in the box or whatever it might be. Ed, I know you're here with us. Did you want to share some final brief remarks about engaging with DePaul? I did see you drop me in the link, but not sure if you wanted to share something.
Well, yeah, oh yeah, thank you. And Dr. Mourey, he's a wonderful professor at DePaul University. He's been helping us a lot in the past with webinars such as these. And as he had mentioned, we have many opportunities to teach and promote the type of degree programs that we have. For those of you who are looking to further your education in the MBA program, it's a 2-year program. It's very convenient, very affordable as well. And as you would find, just definitely with Dr. Mourey's presentation today, it's up to the minute. It's real-time information that serves everyone very well. And, DePaul is well known in the Chicagoland area for its business programs, and we just continue to evolve each and every time. And for those of you who have any inquiries or any questions about the MBA program, feel free to reach out to me. I put my address in the chat, my email address at eramsey@depaul.edu. And we're very happy, as Dr. Mourey had mentioned earlier, about our relationship with the LGBTQ Chamber of Commerce. It's been a wonderful partnership. We've been together, I believe it's been about the last 5 years, Jeremy, if I'm not mistaken. And of course, we'll be doing more and more of these in the future. We're very proud to be partnering with the organization. Jim, you have anything else to kind of mention about the MBA program, being given that you teach?
Yeah, I know.
You clearly have one of the most popular classes, so I'm just letting everyone know that now.
I do. Yeah, that's nice of you. Yeah, I think something that Ed said that is particularly striking is, I know that the MBA curriculum was just recently updated, because one thing that DePaul really cares about, and I think it's the function of being right in the heart of the business district of Chicago, is keeping things up to date, right? We have students that will come in after work, they will go back the next day, and we want to make sure we're teaching them things that they can implement the next day, right? So that's kind of the nature at which we operate, or in which we operate. And I think, like I said, if you're looking to sort of jumpstart your business or jumpstart yourself, right, jumpstart your own skills, that's one thing that's always guaranteed at DePaul, particularly in our MBA program, is we're going to teach you the things that are relevant today at the cutting edge, so you can create value for yourself or for your organization. So if you have any questions, let me know. My contact information is also here. Email me, add me on LinkedIn. We can talk about your personal business. So Christina, it's fun just kind of like thinking of ideas for your company, but I'm happy to do that and brainstorm with any of you. So, but thanks for having me today. And hopefully I didn't give you too many scary flashbacks to statistics, right? Hopefully it was a little bit easier to understand this go around. But yeah, good luck with your companies. And I'm happy to always come back and speak, Jeremy. So you know that.